ISIS is aggressively working on developing chemical weapons. That's according to the Associated Press.
The terror group has reportedly even set up a branch dedicated to chemical warfare.
Juan Zarate is in Washington for us. And Juan, we know that there are reports that ISIS has used chemical weapons in the past, but now we're hearing reports that they want to make chemical weapons. That has been on your radar for some time. How alarming is that?
Well, this is really troubling because it's a manifestation of the worst nightmare, the elixir and combination of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism. A group that is clearly apocalyptic, intent on attacking the West, certainly fellow citizens in the Middle East, and willing to use any means at its disposal. The troubling part here is they've obviously demonstrated a willingness to use it. They've used mustard gas on the field twice, maybe 3 times. What we now have with this reporting is that Iraqi and U.S. Officials are saying that they've developed an actual unit, a group that's dedicated to developing, acquiring, and potentially even strategically using these types of chemical weapons, to include sarin gas, a nerve agent. And so that is really troubling because it demonstrates that when you give these groups time, space, and they have resources, they are going to try to give a manifest and try to develop the tools to bring to fruition their ideology and their terror.
So, Juan, where does their actual capability stand right now, do you think? I mean, with this report, so they're trying to set up this branch that's going to look at the possibilities, what it is that they can actually use, develop. But up until this point, we haven't heard anything about them being able to manufacture these chemical weapons.
It's a great question. I don't think we know enough yet. Certainly this reporting is the first signal from intelligence officials that we know more about how they're trying to organize this work. But what we do know is that they control the second largest city in Iraq, which has universities, it has labs. There are scientists there. We know that they've recruited and paid engineers and scientists. We know that some of the foreign fighters who've come in from abroad, to include from Southeast Asia, have included scientists and experts. And so it's very hard to tell what sort of infrastructure they have. Hopefully, and I think the running assumption has been that it's fairly rudimentary, that they're taking advantage of what's in the environment and testing and probing with the use of mustard gas. But what this report does suggest is that they're being more strategic and more methodical about it. And the danger here is that they have more resources at their command. They're in control of urban environments, and they have access to more personnel than, let's say, Al-Qaeda, which once ran Tarnak farms in the hinterlands of Afghanistan. They're right in the heart of the Middle East and have access to more resources. That's dangerous when you talk about this combination of chemical weapons and terrorism.
Juan, I want to talk to you about another round of raids that have taken place in Belgium. A group of terrorists have been arrested, 9 arrests in all. Any way to estimate how many more are out there?
Well, I think this is a matter of degree. Certainly what the Belgian and French authorities are trying to do is wrap up as many individuals who may be tied to the Paris cell and the Paris attacks as possible. And so that's the first order of battle and why you've seen the raids that you've seen. And no doubt the Belgian and French authorities are sharing information that has led to these initial arrests. There's now going to be a next layer of individuals, those that are associated or connected with these networks that are emerging, that Belgian and French authorities may have known about, may be learning about now, and they're going to start to get a lot of scrutiny. And I think the level of tolerance and risk has changed here for both Belgium and France and the Europeans. And so they're going to be much more aggressive with their arrests. People that they may have just been watching, they may now arrest. People that they may have been ignoring, they may now add additional scrutiny over. And so this is a matter of layers and degrees, and the risk tolerance is very low at this point. And so you're going to see lots of counterterrorism actions, not just in Belgium, but in France and perhaps other parts of Europe.
Juan, what about intelligence sharing? France says it didn't get information that the ringleader behind the Paris attacks was in Europe. They didn't learn of that until after the attacks. What does that tell you about Europe's intelligence services?
Well, information sharing in Europe is imperfect, to say the least. I think it's spotty. It depends on bilateral relations often. There's a lot of suspicions often. And to the extent that you have investigations of nationals, for example, the Belgians investigating a Belgian or a French service investigating a French foreign fighter. That type of information doesn't often get shared easily or quickly with other nations, in part because it's viewed as a national issue. The problem with these groups is they're interacting, they're going across borders in a European environment, they're crossing borders fairly easily. And so what you're seeing is a recognition within Europe and certainly within the Western coalition that we have to amplify and create with some urgency information sharing channels that haven't existed. Keep in mind that President Obama, in his remarks in Turkey just recently, said that one of the things he's done with France was to accelerate the pace of information sharing. You have to ask yourself, why wasn't this done before, both in the American context and certainly within Europe, knowing what we know about ISIS's intent and some of the arrests that we've seen over the past few months?
Juan, I just want to ask you about something that has been talked about in some political circles, but one certainly that I think some people might look at and say that might make sense. The idea that ISIS needs to be approached in a more full-throated way by having the NATO coalition really come together in a way that brings to bear the military power, the intelligence sharing, all of that on ISIS, so that there isn't this problem of sort of lack of coordination, lack of information sharing, and really give a more fulsome kind of approach to ISIS, as opposed to sort of each country doing their own individual planning on the military front, on the intelligence front.
I think that's right. I think one of the asymmetric advantages that ISIS and any of these transnational groups has is that they could move fluidly between borders. Their nationalities really don't matter, and they're coordinating fairly effectively. What nation states have to contend with is the fact that every country is dealing with its own laws, its own authorities, its own view of the problem. I think with Paris, though, you have a galvanizing moment, a moment where France and Europe is recognizing that they're at war, they're at risk. Their way of life perhaps is even under attack. And so that, I think, will reshape the way that the coalition views the threat. Now, the real question is, what does that mean in practice? What does that mean on the ground? What does that mean in terms of information sharing, boots on the ground, military tactics, the war of ideas, all these things that have to happen at once, in addition to the political solution in Syria? All of that has to take place. But the reality here, and I think this is something, going back to our original discussion about the chemical weapons threat, the reality is this is a physical problem. This is a group that controls territory. They have an army. They have thousands of foreign fighters. They're developing strategies and units to imagine even worse attacks in the West. And so there's a real question here as to how you physically dislodge this group and how you stop their momentum, because it doesn't feel like they're contained.
We've seen them cross borders, but before you go, is it harder for them to get into the U.S.? What's the chance that there's somebody like, Abdelhamid Abu-Ed already in the U.S.?
It is harder for them to get into the U.S., but it's not impossible. We know that there is a black market trade in passports, actually not that expensive to get relatively good passports. I've worked with some researchers who've been on the ground, who've gone to these passport cafes where passports can be exchanged or sold, and fake passports bought rather easily, and they pass most security checks. And so you've got a real problem of fake passports, multiple nationalities, the fact that Westerners, including Americans, have gone to fight and can come back relatively easily. And you've got the visa waiver countries where Europeans, some of them, can come into the U.S. Without a visa. So it doesn't require the scrutiny that you would otherwise imagine. So it is harder, but it's not impossible. And I think that's why U.S. officials are concerned.
All right, Juan Zarate, thank you.